Why France is getting rejected by all African countries? What actually went wrong? Before now, France had been known for all the positive steps it had taken in maintaining peace in the African continent. The French president, Emmanuel Macron, hasn't stopped at nothing to make life easier for former French colonies in Africa, from providing aid, returning stolen cultural artifacts taken during the colonial war, engaging young African minds and civil societies directly, to even protecting them by sending French troops to fight off jihadist militants that waste the lives of the local people. So, where did it all go wrong that African countries, especially West Africa, had to turn their back on France? For decades now, the concept of Françafrique has reigned. During the post-independence decades, France maintained a close personal relationship with African leaders and elites, especially past colonized African countries. In actuality, France mostly cared for a mutual protection of interests more than it cared for human rights of the African countries involved. In summary, France greatly cared for all they could benefit from the affected African countries and vice versa, and anything unnecessary couldn't come in the way. But some people saw this as another means of neo-colonialism, but the affected African countries were welcoming of it, specifically if it could help their situation in the Sahel, especially. It wasn't like they had a choice, actually. They needed help and would take whatever help was offered. The African countries that were mostly affected by the jihadist militants in the Sahel were the West African countries, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. They needed France's help to end the constant killings in their region. However, Macron's neo-colonial arrogance was a factor that led to the tension of the former peaceful relationship between France and these West African countries. Mr. Macron's self-confidence and arrogance in failing to refuse that these former colonized countries in Africa now had their own leaderships and authority, without directly answering to its former colonizer France in this case. Mr. Macron had his fair share of diplomatic blunders, but the one in 2019 angered a lot of people. As we know, Macron had sent French troops to Africa to help combat the problems with jihadist militants, but in 2019, something unfortunate happened. 13 French troops had died in a helicopter crash in Mali in November 2019, and Mr. Macron demanded that the West African leaders fly to France for an emergency summit. This was seen as neo-colonial arrogance, because Mali and Niger had suffered greater military losses only recently. He did retrace this insensitivity of his by flying down to Niger's capital, Niamey, to pay his respects to the dead Nigerian military and postpone the summit to January 2020. But before that, let's talk about how the ill sentiments towards France and French President Emmanuel Macron started long before. Actually, it all began before Mr. Macron's tenure as president in 2017, in fact. When Rwanda needed France in 1994 as its ally, France was nowhere to be found, and the regime of the then president of Rwanda, Juvenal Habyarimana, looked towards genocide. Though, in Rwanda, in the year 2021, Mr. Macron publicly acknowledged France's fault in Rwanda's 1994 genocide. During the mid-1990s, several governments leaned towards a reform of France's relationship with Africa, and to also give importance to its democratic governance and priority. But the motivation from the 90s didn't live too long, as in 2007, then President of France, Nicolas Sarkozy, made a tactless statement just at the beginning of his tenure. He said, "The African man has not sufficiently entered into history." He also had a notable partiality towards old allies such as the Bongo family, who had ruled Gabon since 1967. So much for democracy. François Hollande's tenure in 2012 saw him focusing on the pressing security issues in the Sahel, so he left reform efforts aside. Now, come Emmanuel Macron in 2017, where he was readily available to speak about and implement reforms. In 2021, he even invited civil society groups and youth and cultural leaders to the 2021 France-Africa Summit in Montpellier. The usual audience at the summit are presidents from the continent. The only downside with all of his promises to the reform of African countries is its absence from the security issues in the Sahel. Over 5,000 French troops have been deployed to the African continent, and about 50 have been killed off. Yet, there really hasn't been any change, and the jihadist militants keep wasting lives with the locals, and even military help from France and the affected countries. For reasons such as economically, environmentally, and militarily, France has been unable to defeat these terrorists wreaking havoc in West Africa. And a percentage of local public opinion believes that France, as a powerful Western military power, should have been able to overcome it by now. They believe that if France can't fix the problem, then there really isn't any need for them to hang around. Hence, they took bold steps to stop France from interfering any longer in their affairs. In November 2021, protesters blocked a convoy of French troops from entering their countries as they crossed Burkina Faso and Niger. They were heading north to help assist in fighting against jihadist militants, but they kept getting blockaded by protesters who didn't want their presence anymore. The long-time backing of local dictators, whether corrupt or not, by the French government has not sat well with the citizens of the former colonies. It was probably where all the ill sentiments towards France began all belong. On the other hand, Mr. Macron's support for ECOWAS to discourage coups and ensure democracy has been for a good place. However, the body itself is not perceived as genuine by a lot of young people, who see it as another means of corruption on the part of West African leaders. It is perceived as some sort of West African president's immunity, as they fail to condemn the manipulation of democratic rules by civilian rulers, and fail to recognise the massive support for military leaders of coups that promise reforms instead. So, Mr. Macron's support and alliance with ECOWAS makes it seem like there is some unacceptable collaboration between the two, ECOWAS and France, in the background. And in 2023, Mr. Macron of France decided to say goodbye to most of the Sahel as well. Françafrique greatly deteriorated that year, and it was evident in December 2023 when the France embassy in Niger decided to end all diplomatic relations with the country, and the last of French troops left Niger's capital, Niamey, as well. In July of that same year, France originally suspended all relations with Niamey, Niger. It had been a big blow for France because Niger housed one of France's biggest bases on the continent. Meanwhile, the growing anti-French sentiments had begun in Mali since 2020, after coup-led Colonel Assimi Goïta overthrew France-backed President Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta. So, the further breakage between the two governments in 2022 was far awaited. The 4,500-strong Operation Barkhane Force, the French troops in Mali, departed from Mali in August 2022, and early the following year, in February 2023, the French troops in Burkina Faso also departed the West African country. The 400-man French troops who had first been deployed in 2009 to help fight off the violence that had spilled over from Burkina Faso's neighbouring country, Mali, left after 15 years of service. This came after the military-led government in Ouagadougou asked that the French troops in the country leave in January and gave a withdrawal ultimatum of 4 weeks. The relationship between France and Burkina Faso soured once coup-led Captain Ibrahim Traoré started leading his country in 2022. And unfortunately for France, Captain Traoré leaned towards Russia more, and he had actively started announcing several partnerships with Russia that same year. In November 2023, a Russian military aircraft landed in Burkina Faso, signalling the end of the reign of French military efforts in the West African country. The affected African countries are also looking to one day decry the franc CFA, known as a colonial currency, and employ the use of an African currency. France has also made counter-moves on the 3 West African military-led countries, Niger, Burkina Faso and Mali, to somewhat equal the damage of France's military competence and power. It suspended student visas to the 3 rebelling countries in September 2023, citing the degrading security relations with their military-led governments. 2023 has been a busy year between the two governments, marking a significant time where France's hold on its West African allies greatly shrank. For France and Francophone West African countries, the ties have been severed, although Paris, France still maintains a military presence in Chad, Djibouti, Côte d'Ivoire, Gabon, and Senegal. But what do you think about all of this? Do you think there should have been a better way for France to make peace with its West African allies? Drop your comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, hit the like and subscribe button.